Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. Her name is Sally Denton. She just published a book, June 28th, 2022. Title of that book is The Colony, Faith and Blood in a Promised Land. Really fascinating book. Her publisher sent me a copy of it. I read through most of it. Really fascinating. This is not her first book. She's a very accomplished writer with really a great CV. And I'll go through list some of her titles. But her bio is that she is an investigative reporter, author, and historian who writes about the subjects others ignore, from a drug conspiracy in Kentucky to organized crime in Las Vegas, from corruption within the Mormon Church to murdered women in New Mexico, from one of America's bitterest political campaigns to the powerful forces arrayed against Franklin D. Roosevelt. While the subject of her books at first glance seemed varied or disparate, they are actually unified by a central theme of the exploration of subjects in American history that have been neglected or marginalized, and characters whom I return to their rightful places in history. She's a Guggenheim Fellow, a Woodrow Wilson Public Scholar, a Black Mountain Kluge Fellow, and the recipient of the Robert Laxalt Distinguished Writer Award and 2 Western Heritage Awards. Her book, The Profiteers, Bechdel, and the Men Who Built the World, won Best Investigative Book of 2016 from Investigative Reporters and Editors, or the IRE. She's been inducted into the Nevada Writers Hall of Fame and is a decades-long resident of Santa Fe, New Mexico, close to where the events of this happened. She's the mother of 3 sons and is married to journalist and author John L. Smith. Her website is her full name, sallydenton.com, www.sallydenton.com. I'll put that in the show notes. And her Twitter handle is @SallyDenton. And some of her books are The Money and the Power, that was written in 2002. Faith and Betrayal, a pioneer woman's passage in the American West, 2007. American Massacre, The Tragedy at Mountain Meadows, that was in September 1857. That was published in 2007 and ties into this book. Passion and Principle, John and Jessie Fremont, the couple whose power, politics, and love shaped 19th century America. That's 2008. And then Bechdel book, that was 2016. And then The Bluegrass Conspiracy, an inside story of power, greed, drugs, and murder. That was published 2016. Plot Against the President, FDR, A Nation in Crisis and the Rise of the American Right, 2019. And then The Pink Lady, The Many Lives of Helen Gahagan Douglas. And again, we're going to talk about this one again. Really fascinating book. I knew little pieces of it, but she went much more in depth. And then what I knew, title again is The Colony, Faith and Blood in a Promised Land, Sally Denton. So welcome to the show, Sally.
Thanks, William, for having me.
Excellent. So for people, you have a long background. Can you kind of talk about your books and what led you to write this one, The Colony?
Yeah, as you outlined all of my books, it took a lot of these books to get to this particular one. I'm just kind of describe the current one, The Colony, which is the most recently published one, and then I'll talk about how it got me, how all my other books got me to this. But basically, this story is about a massacre of women and children on November 4th in 2019. A caravan of women and children were brutally attacked while traveling through northern Mexico, leaving 9 dead and 5 gravely wounded. The 3 women and 6 of their children were murdered. They were shot at close range, essentially executed, and one of the women, they were all in SUVs, and one of the women and her 4 children were actually burned alive. And the victims were, this is in northern, the attack happened in northern Mexico in the state of Sonora. But the family that I write about, many of the victims were from a town in Chihuahua called Colonia LeBaron. And the victims were all members of the LeBaron community and La Mora community in Sonora, and they were related to each other. These are both fundamentalist Mormon outposts whose forebears broke from the Mormon Church and settled in Mexico when polygamy was outlawed in the United States in the 1890s. So it goes back that far. The case was brutal. The women it became clear that they were attacked, that they were targeted. There was no case of mistaken identity. There was no, initially, some of the early I guess, investigators on the scene said that they were caught in a crossfire between rival cartels in the region, but that soon became clear that that was not the case. There was videotape evidence of the attack on them, and the case is still open. There were as many as 100 shooters carrying long guns and automatic weapons, and one of the cars had 321 bullet casings in it, and it was broad daylight. And so they were. It became clear very early on that they were targeted. They had been in the region, as I said, for decades, and some back to the 19th century, the families. So they were well known in the region, and the case is still open. And so my book picks up where the initial reporting left off, revealing the violent history of the LeBaron clan and their homestead down there from the first polygamist immigrations to Mexico in the 1880s through the LeBarons' own family violent blood feud in the 1970s, and even the family's alliance with the Nexium sex cult in Albany, and up to the rising tensions with neighboring cartels and local farmers over smuggling routes and dwindling water reserves in the region. The LeBaron colony has huge, massive pecan and walnut farms that are extraordinarily profitable. And
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you'll see that if you're on YouTube and you see the cover of the book, this is the LeBaron compound, and the green trees are those nut trees, right?
Right. That's it. And you can see that, well, it's not that obvious here, but they are surrounded. It's a tiny community of between 3,500 and 5,000 full-time residents that come and go because a lot of their family members also live in the United States. This family, many of them have dual American citizenship, especially the men. As I mentioned, it's a fundamentalist offshoot of the mainstream Mormon Church in Salt Lake, headquartered in Salt Lake City. Mexico has.
Right, but it's interesting because this offshoot, this splinter group, has its legacy going all the way back to Joseph Smith, right?
So, and I trace that. I mean,
yes.
they claim that they are directly descended from one of Joseph Smith's closest confidants and advisors, and someone who they claim Joseph Smith transferred the mantle to lead the church to. So the patriarchs of this community believe that they are directly descended from Joseph Smith. And as you can see on that cover, wherever it's not the big green trees, it's surrounded by often, significantly more blighted land around them, but they're surrounded by huge agricultural enterprises run by natives of the Mexicans and indigenous people that have been farming in that region for many, many years, which created a lot of tension. And
right, so.
In that story, in this book, I developed inside sources within drug enforcement and law enforcement on both sides of the border, and even sources within the cartels, as well as a pipeline into the sisterhood of women in the colony. And to those who had escaped to the States and who still live there, and prioritizing their perspectives within the community, and which is how I came to want to write about this story to begin with. The first thing I thought when I saw this is, why are these women and children traveling alone on one of the most dangerous roads in the world? Where are their husbands? Where were they that day? They had warnings the night before that there was violence on this trafficking route. And it just begged the question from the beginning, where were the husbands? And the men of the LeBaron colony, historically, traditionally, famously travel routinely with armed bodyguards. So it just stuck out. So that is kind of the, I guess it is the culmination. As you said, this is my 9th book, And this is kind of the culmination of these other 8 books that, if you look back at them, as you pointed out, it seems that uh, they deal with disparate subjects. Actually, the Bluegrass Conspiracy was my first one. It was about a drug trafficking ring in Lexington, Kentucky, that I wrote about. I wrote as and reported as an investigative reporter for the CBS affiliate in Lexington, Kentucky, in the 1980s. And this book was actually published in 1989. That's my first book, and has gotten the most attention of all of my books. It was a huge expose of a group of men that were connected through familial ties, wealthy men in the Lexington blue blood community. I think that the book, the edition that you referred to, was a repub in
Okay, sorry about that.
2016. But that's really the first book, and probably the one that I initially was, I'm still best known for, because it brought so much attention. And that book started with my examination into the disappearance and murders of a couple of women that were around this drug trafficking ring, and that were, party girls with the blue blood thoroughbred horse partying, community of Lexington, Kentucky.
Right, and there's a lot of that out there, right? So there was drugs. There was actually a huge growing operation, or
Yeah,
like that at that time.
I mean, that still is, an amazing story. But to get to that, even, I would have to go further. If you want to know how my writing career started. Actually, it was I started with a little newspaper in northern New Mexico, outside of Santa Fe, and one of my first stories was about all these murdered women that were disappearing. And I kept, the bodies would turn up, and I was a young 25-year-old reporter, 23-year-old reporter with a weekly newspaper. And I didn't know, my degree is in English literature from the University of Colorado. I didn't take any journalism. And it was a fluke that I ended up in with a job in at a little newspaper. But I was trying to learn as fast as I could, literally going to the library and reading, Edward R. Murrow, and learning about who, what, why, when. It was just, I was so green. And right off the bat, I was sent out to do stories about these murdered. They were all young. They were all beautiful. They were my age, 23, Hispanic, in this really benighted little community of Espanola. And I finally, after a few weeks of this and new to the job, I went to the owner of the newspaper, the publisher, and Bob Trapp, and I said, I mean, literally, I was so green and naive that every single day I would call the chief of the state police and say, are there any new leads in the Francine Valerio case? Francine Valerio, I call her my first victim, my first murder victim. And I would call and they'd say, no, nothing yet. And there were all these rumors, and everybody in the community seemed to know who had bludgeoned her to death. And so I went to Bob Trapp, the publisher, and I said, I don't think they're even trying to solve these cases. And he said, well, they never solve anything up here. And I said, we agreed that I would go back and look in the morgue and pull out all these, old newspaper stories. And sure enough, I think we came up with almost, I think there were 13 victims, all young women, who were murdered in a brutal way in, just a few years. And none of the cases were solved. And long story short, we got a special grand jury and opened some of those cases. They ended up being tied directly to the state capitol in Santa Fe. They were couriers of heroin. So, at 25 years old, I had exposed a huge heroin ring in northern New Mexico, and the murders of at least 13. I think before it was over, we were up into the 20s of unsolved murders related to the heroin trade. And so that was kind of my first experience. And as a result of that, I won, awards in the state of New Mexico. And the big, what you always talk about, the turn in the road that changes direction, because I never wanted to be a reporter. I wanted to write mysteries. Jack Anderson, the legendary investigative reporter and muckraker from Washington, D.C., heard about these exposés that this young woman in New Mexico did, and he hired me and brought me to Washington, D.C. to work for
Wow.
him. And
Oh,
at that
wow. That's
moment,
amazing. That's
it
amazing.
was amazing, and at that moment, this is just post Watergate. So it was 1979, and Jack had it was a powerful journalism empire. He was published in he was syndicated in 1,000 newspapers
Wow.
in the United
Wow.
States,
He
and
was like a true investigative reporter,
he was a true
independent, yeah,
and
very honest,
he was
integrity,
Mormon.
right?
He
Yeah,
was Mormon
Mormon,
from
right?
Salt Lake
Yeah.
City. And when I got there, it was so heady. There were only about, I'd say, 15 of us working for him, and we're all in our 20s. And they were, he was in 1,000 newspapers. He was on Good Morning America 3 days a week. He was on Mutual Broadcast Radio 5 days a week. He was in Parade magazine, and we were digging up all these kids. Basically, we're digging up stories all over the country. And my first job with him as an intern initially was to sit in this room, and every single day the mailman would bring a gunny sack full of letters to Jack Anderson. It's important to know he inherited the column from Drew Pearson, who was even more famous than he was from the 40s and 50s.
I never heard that name. Yeah, I don't know that
Yeah,
name.
he inherited the column from Drew. And these were letters. I always thought I grew up in Las Vegas, outside of Las Vegas, Nevada, and I always thought that Nevada was uh, uniquely corrupt. And then I did the job in New Mexico, and I thought New Mexico was really uniquely corrupt. Well, once I saw these bags full of letters from all over the country, and I'm telling you, they were little letters, people sending him $1. Please explore, please investigate my city council in this town in Louisiana. I'm convinced they're corrupt and they're taking bribes. Please come and look at my state in Montana. There's kickbacks going, and it was from all over the country. And it was just like sifting through those. Was like a needle in a haystack to find a story that was going to be a national story that Jack wanted to, dig his teeth into. But he had so much clout on Capitol Hill that, once I got through the internship and he hired me, we were basically, I could pick up the phone and call a United States senator and say, "This is Sally Denton. I work for Jack Anderson." And the senator would take my call. Everybody was scared to death of Jack Anderson, and everybody talked, and it was just really what turned out to be almost a graduate degree in investigative reporting.
I
Just
bet.
not just Jack, but the people around him that were, that mentored me. So
And it was very cloak and dagger type stuff back then too, pre-internet.
right.
He was always I think he felt pressured at certain times during his
Well, it was
career,
cloak
right?
and dagger
Yeah.
because Richard Nixon, attempted to have him assassinated.
Okay, well that's
And
probably it.
yeah, they put, I think it was LSD on his steering wheel at one point. There were
Oh wow.
there were several attempts just around the Watergate era, and during the Nixon administration to have him killed. So it was heady stuff. And but I went, from there to Kentucky, and the first thing I started investigating are murdered women. And I thought, well, this is unusual. I just investigated murdered women in New Mexico. And as I moved up the line of my career, that's kind of what all of my books have in common is finding these people. In my view, the murdered women are the women that were not able to speak for themselves or have any justice on their behalf. And so I kind of took that to, writ large, with basically exposing secrets that people. I always just kind of started looking at, why did this happen? Who's responsible for this happening? How did this happen? And who doesn't want you to know about it? And basically, that's been my career.
So giving shining light on those events. There's a lot of stuff that's happening in New Mexico. I mean, there's a lot. It's pretty rough, and I mean, even the Western role of the Mormons was rough, right? I mean, you
Absolutely.
talk, yeah. Can you talk about how the government tried to clamp down on what you call the principle, or what the Mormons call the principle, and what led to the Mountain Meadows massacre?
Yeah, the Mountain Meadows massacre, I wrote about. American Massacre is the book. That was an event that happened in 1857 where, basically the, Mormon pioneers in Utah, attacked a wagon train, the wealthiest wagon train to ever cross the country, and it was a wagon train full of women and children and, a group from Arkansas that was moving their entire, they had been in Arkansas for generations, and they were moving to California. This was all during the gold rush era, and they had 1,000 head of cattle and weapons and gold and women's finery, and basically they were ambushed. They had to go through Utah territory to get to California, and at this time, Brigham Young, who was then the head of the Mormon Church, was at basically at a Cold War, I guess I would say, with the United States, which was trying to get control of Utah territory, which had been set up by Brigham Young as a theocracy, a theocratic nation state, essentially. So they attacked this wagon train, and it was brutal. 140 women and men. They were laid under siege for 5 days with no water and under a false flag of truce. And it's just, it's one of the most brutal and one-on-one, European Mormon, well, the Mormons dressed up as Indians and slaughtered the wagon train, and they would have gotten away with it, and that would have been that, except that it was one of the reasons they ultimately, the U.S. government knew that it was the Mormons who perpetrated it, was that they saved everybody under the age of 8 years old, because 8 is the age of innocence in the Mormon faith. So several of the children who were 8 years old and 6 and 7 and 8 years old, who could remember what happened as their parents were brutally slaughtered by, knives, and I mean throats cut and
Children shot, like the whole bit. Yeah.
yeah, the whole bit. But they were able to remember, and they told U.S. government officials that that the killers were Indians. But then they went to, after all the killing was done, they went to the river and washed their faces, and they were white men. And then these same white men who had killed their families took all the survived. There were 17 surviving children, and took them and dispersed them between families. So there was ultimately congressional testimony that that led to the Mormon culpability, which is why the U.S. government then started really buckling down on Utah and holding them accountable. They wanted somebody held accountable for this slaughter. And this is why I kind of weave in the history into this recent book of the massacre of the young women and children in Mexico, because Brigham Young sent some of the perpetrators of this massacre down to Mexico, and outside of the United States. I mean, this is, it was still part of, even the southern United States was part of Mexico, but sent the perpetrators to northern Mexico to hide out. And so some of the descendants, in fact, I draw a direct line to one of the descendants who was in control, was ordered the killing of the children, is a direct forebear of Colonia, the men of Colonia LeBaron. And so that's why I end up, the book is The Colony, the Faith and Blood in a Promised Land, which is a true crime story about, something that happened just 3 years ago, has a direct connection to all of the history, which is why the book is more laden with history than a usual true crime book would be.
Right. It's really fascinating, though, because some of these ideas, the blood atonement, go all the way back to this early Mormon. And I think the Mountain Massacre had happened in the southwestern part of Utah, right? So
Yes,
closer to Vegas, yeah. So they were almost kind of what the train was almost out of
almost
the
out of the
territory.
territory.
Yeah.
And they had been, they were coming across, and they were planning to go across northern Utah through Salt Lake City and rest their cattle and make the final push through, across Donner Pass and into California. And Mormon scouts came and met them there and said that there was too much snow in the Donner and the Rock and the Sierra, and said that they should go south to Mountain Meadow, a beautiful meadow that was full of grass for the cattle, which is what lured them down there. And it was a perfect ambush. It was a spot that, had a narrow opening and a narrow closing, and they were just outside the range of, getting to California.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. And so that was at the time. So after that, that was 1857. And so then they also wanted to like the principle of polygamy was supposed
Okay,
to be
so
secret, right?
um,
Supposed to be secret.
well, yeah, they didn't. The church did not acknowledge it for many years. Which is another reason I bring in, as you mentioned, the book Faith and Betrayal. That's a book about my great great grandmother who was converted to Mormonism in 1849 in England, and came across by wagon train, brought the first piano into the inter-American, Intermountain West, and she was converted with the understanding that they were not practicing polygamist. And then when she got to Utah, it became clear that polygamy was very much a part of the faith, and had been even under Joseph Smith. It was Joseph Smith has died by the time Brigham Young and the Mormons had gotten to Salt Lake. But it was considered a viable and essential part. Celestial marriage was essential part of the faith, be an essential part of the male-female relationship, because in only the worthy men could go to the promised land, could go to eternity, and only the worthy men could. The only way that women could get there was to be pulled through the veil by a worthy man. So it was, and it was uh, important for the man to have as many wives as possible. It was all part of, building the kingdom of God on earth, because this was they had been persecuted in New York and in Ohio and on the whole way across the country before Joseph Smith was ultimately killed by an angry mob. But the polygamy was very much a part of maintaining and building not just the kingdom on earth, but also the kingdom in heaven. And the women were very much a part of the and accepted the role of that. I mean, by whoever didn't was gone by the time of the early 1870s, 1880s. But the women were seen as, the only value was in reproducing, and they are considered chattel. And that, to this day, in that colony, the women, the men, the patriarchal men of Colonia LeBaron have 50 children, and 4 or 5 wives and 50 children and 100 and some grandchildren, and that's considered, that's their empire.
Right. And it did, the polygamy solidified the male hierarchy too, right? So
Absolutely, and much of, I'm not a Mormon scholar, but at this point I've written a lot about Mormon history, and it was always used from the beginning of Joseph Smith to wield power and influence with his male followers. He was the only one who could could provide wives to his male followers, and that continued on through Brigham Young. So there was, a great competition for the men, the followers of the prophet, to gain favor with the prophet, who could then provide them with their new wives.
right, very important. So the prophet maintains control through the dispersion of wives that you need to get to the celestial heaven, so that it makes the prophet even more important. Because the prophet, I think it was even Warren Jeffs too, who was an offshoot. He
Right.
was the one who distributed the females, and the women had no choice. Don't get any choice in the matter.
Right, and I write about that in The Colony, which is contemporary. We're not talking about the 1800s,
Right.
but the patriarchs, the men decide basically, who the wives are going to be. Mexico, polygamy is illegal in Mexico and the United States. Mexico allowed this group of polygamists from the United States to come in. In fact, Brigham Young and the Mormon Church bought the original land for the colonies in Mexico. But so they kind of got grandfathered in. And so even though polygamy is not legal in Mexico, there haven't been crackdowns on the polygamous colonies in Mexico before.
Well, and that area of Mexico is kind of like the south parts of the Southwest. It was considered arid,
right?
hard to
Very
inhabit.
similar to Utah.
That's right.
And in fact, I write a lot in this, as I'm looking for motives, which is, what I did from the beginning. I didn't expect to ever solve the massacre. I figured, if dozens of Mexican and American law enforcement officials couldn't do it, and they have subpoena power and armies of investigators. I figured if they hadn't done it, that I wasn't going to be able to solve it. But so I really set out to look for the reason behind it, look for the motives behind it, and along the way, I came across. I said to my editor at one point, this was like Murder on the Orient Express. Find somebody who didn't have a beef with the LeBarons, because like you said, it's in an arid land, much like Salt Lake City. So the Great Salt Lake was when Brigham Young settled it. And they have spent several decades expropriating the water that the local communities feel has, was supposed to be for all of the communities, and the water that they've accused the LeBarons of drilling illegal wells and dropping the water table so that there's no water available for the smaller indigenous communities. And it's not only that, there's everybody needs the water. I mean, this is a ground zero for climate change in an arid land, because the cartels need the water for, growing poppies, growing marijuana. The fentanyl labs, the methamphetamine labs need water. The avocado growers need water. The agave growers for tequila need water. Everybody needs the water, and it's a dwindling supply, and the LeBarons stick out like a sore thumb in controlling it all.
Right. And I mean, there's parts of this book are very strange. The blood atonement, Ervil LeBaron. There's a whole part of this story that gets really ugly, much like the Mountain Meadows massacre. And people can read more about that. We're at about 33 minutes, Sally. Do you have time for a few questions?
Sure.
So Sabrina's asks, how large is the existing colony in Mexico?
The Colonia LeBaron right now, I think, is about 3,500 people. A lot of people left after the massacre. It can be up to 5,000 people. As I said, a lot of people have dual American citizenship, so they go back and forth across the border. And a lot of the men from Colonia LeBaron work in the United States, and which is creating a whole other problem for the colony, because a lot of the women are left behind. There's, say, 4 wives of one male landowner, and overseeing these huge nut plantations, essentially, and overseeing the labor of mostly Mexican and Native workers.
So right, you said it almost functions like a matriarchy, right? You wouldn't believe it, but
well, I mean, that's one of the things I explored. It never had before. As I said, the women were, completely subservient. Their only value was in their reproductive abilities, and generally the women were pregnant, gave birth 18 months apart, and were, pregnant from the time they became able to get pregnant until the time they could no longer produce. And so, that's the women would have 13 or more children. But that's changing now with some of the women down there who are actually rising to have control over some of the production, the agricultural production, and dealing with some of the business interests in their own right. I do one of the interesting things that I found. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things in this book that
Right.
it just doesn't stop. But around the same time that this was happening, El Chapo Guzman was also really allowing his organization. His organization, the Sinaloa cartel, was evolving into more of a matriarchy. He trusted women more than men, and Emma Coronel Aspuro, his wife, who was recently arrested in the United States, had extraordinary power in the Sinaloa cartel. So that's worthy of another book down the road for somebody
Right.
else. But
There's another huge family too. I think he had like 15 sons or something
yeah,
like that.
yeah,
Like, really wild. And you mentioned in your book there's been a lot of apostates out of these groups, right? A lot of books
absolutely.
written. Yeah.
Yeah, there's been a lot of memoirs written by women who have escaped. It's such a sad story, and I really, I'm not one that likes to, mythologize, female victims here or anything. I want to get to the bottom of it and find out, who's doing this, who's killing these women, and why. And it's so weird. This is kind of full circle back to where we started, William, but it was after that my first series of murders in Espanola in the 1970s. I keep coming full circle. I've done a book in Lexington. I've written The Money and the Power about the rise of organized crime in Las Vegas. And I have found that every place that I go and live, where I've lived, if you're just watching the newspapers and, women are disappearing or turning up dead, if you start looking at who murdered the women of this community, you're going to get to the power structure of that city.
Wow.
And it's just, it was mind blowing to me. It took me 9 books to figure that out.
That's what happened in Ciudad Juarez, right? The whole femicide down
Exactly.
there.
Yeah.
Power structure. I mean, that's kind of right in your area. Truth or Consequences. There's a bunch of
Well, and also
femicides there.
West Mesa of Albuquerque, there were
Right, that story. Yeah.
been, tons of prostitutes that have been murdered and found there. And so if you start looking, of course, nobody cares about murdered prostitutes, but you start looking into it, and who is who's going to benefit from silencing prostitutes, and that's powerful men that have been paying them, that are married, or political officials, or people who have been bribed. So it just, you go up that chain and it takes you to the top.
Right. And Dale asks, did the author's grandmother remain a practicing Mormon after she converted?
No, she didn't. She actually, there's actually two. My great grandmother, who brought the piano, when she got there, she had converted and had 7 children and brought them from England. And she had her own means, which was unusual. I mean, she did bring the piano, and Brigham Young took it from her and gave it to his favorite wife. But as soon as the railroad came in 1869, she was on one of the first trains, by all account, and went to California and she stayed a Christian, and but she abandoned Mormonism and became a Unitarian. And but then part of the book, Faith and Betrayal, also traces, and as does The Colony, my new book, but it's not obvious that that's what it does. I don't reveal some of the relationships till the end of the book. But my great grandmother came to Utah as a little 9-year-old Danish girl pushing a hand cart, and she became a second wife. And my grandmother was raised in polygamy in Utah, the 23rd child of a polygamist. And this is why it was emotional and front and center for me when the church in Utah made it illegal for the polygamists to practice polygamy, and many of them went to Mexico. my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and her 13 children, all of a sudden, she was a concubine and they were bastards. And the state didn't take care of them. This was, the church did that in exchange for statehood from the United States. The state didn't take care of them. The church didn't take care of them. And so I just kind of have that in my DNA growing. I was not raised Mormon, but growing up and having that family history, there was, a sense of not fair.
Yeah, and also you're part of the pioneer westward flow of people into Western United States, so you're part of that topography. And is there anything you'd like to add, or anything I missed before we wrap this up? We're about the 40-minute mark.
I don't think so. I feel like I've done all the talking, but
yeah, you've done a lot. I mean, it's a really fascinating book. There's a lot more to the story. There's a lot of blood feuds and insanity south of the border, but people can read about it in the colony, and there's an audio book for this as well, right?
Yes. And it even, talk about a curveball in the middle of the research. There's a connection to Nexium in Albany.
Right. That's amazing. Can you talk? What is that connection? Didn't he flee to Mexico? Didn't Ranieri?
No, he didn't. Well, he was in Mexico but he was recruiting young underage girls from Colonia LeBaron to come to his colony in upstate New York.
Wow. I missed that part of the story. That's incredible. So they were. Do you think Nexium was involved in more human trafficking than publicly acknowledged? Do you know?
I did not cover. This was just one aspect of the Nexium. I didn't cover the trials, but as soon as I saw the Colonia LeBaron connection, I delved into that aspect.
That's amazing. And the best place to reach you, Sally, you have social media and you also have a website, your full name, right?
Yeah, Sally, www.sallydenton.com. My email is sally@sallydenton.com, and I'm on Twitter at Sally Denton. And I don't know about Facebook. I might be on there.
So if people can reach out to you if they have any questions.
Absolutely.
Do you and where's the best place to get the book? Do you sell books from your website or Amazon?
They're on sale on the website and of course Amazon and every other bookstore.
So people can get signed copies if they want them from you, right?
Yes.
God, cool. So that's at sallydenton.com. Sally, fascinating book and great discussion. Thanks so much for your time. Again, the title of the book is The Colony, Faith and Blood in a Promised Land, and the author again is Sally Denton, just published June 28th, 2022. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
All right, stay there.